So today we have another round of memories about Walt Disney. In the late 1960s, a couple of years after Walt's passing, Roy Disney asked that members of the Disney organization write down their memories about Walt for a forthcoming biography that the studio and the Disney family had commissioned. But that biography was never published. The family then hired another writer to develop a book-length biography, but that book as well was also never published. The company and family wouldn't approve a biography until the third author penned his attempt. That version was called Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas. But during those 10 years between the first attempt at a biography and then the book that was finally published, these memories of Walt went missing. A lot of things changed inside the company during those 10 years, including the death of Roy Disney, and by the time we get up to the mid-1970s, I don't think anyone was tracking the material that had been gathered for that first unpublished book. None of these stories were included in the finished biography by Bob Thomas. But today, we'll look at another set of those lost memories. As with the previous 2 volumes in this series, you are about to hear some memories that have been more or less locked away for a half-century. Here we go. Our first story today comes from Bob Jackson. Jackson is probably best known in Disney circles for helping to oversee the Mineral King ski resort that Walt wanted to build in the mid to late 60s, and we'll actually get to a Mineral King story later today. But when Bob Jackson first arrived at Disney in 1963, he was a publicity manager who also worked with public relations, who, among other things, oversaw the itineraries of important guests who were visiting the studio. This is the story of one group of guests where the visit didn't go entirely as Walt had planned. Walt was like a lot of us. He didn't appreciate it if he was made to look foolish. One time, we were taking some visitors through the studio, showing off all the nice equipment and special gadgets and stuff. He paraded his party into the ink and paint department where there was a big built-in refrigerator for paints that had to be stored at a special temperature. The thing had 2 doors. He stood in front of it explaining to his guests about his special paint and this special refrigerator. Then he swung open one of the doors so they could see the paint. He wasn't really looking at the refrigerator. He was looking at his guests, and he noticed that they looked terribly odd. Then he noticed that all the girls in the room were watching him in a stunned kind of way. He turned around and looked in the refrigerator. It had a half quart of milk and some cottage cheese in it, no paint. He didn't say anything at the time, just opened the other door and showed the paint. But the next day, a memo came down from someplace, probably personnel, to say that the refrigerator was for paints and that nobody should keep their personal effects in it. Our next story as well is about another studio visit that had some unusual problems. This story is from Otto Englander, a story artist who started at the studio in 1934. And this story involves storyboards. Storyboards are cork boards onto which artists post drawings and sometimes bits of dialogue to shape out a sequence in a cartoon or later in a feature. For a short cartoon, you would have many storyboards, likely one for each sequence. And one more thing here. Some of you might be more familiar with certain storyboards that Disney used in the 1950s and 1960s, ones which were mounted on sets of wheels so they could be taken from room to room. But back in the 1930s, Disney also had standard bulletin boards, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, that could be laid against each other, maybe 10 or 12 boards deep, usually with the first one presenting the first sequence in a cartoon. And then, if you were reviewing the action, you might move through the boards until you got to the end of the cartoon. Here's how this particular tale goes. There was a story man who used to drink rather a lot. It was a Monday morning after a heavy weekend, and he felt the need of a place to get out of the storm and rest a bit. There was an empty room with a set of storyboards sitting on the floor and resting against the wall. That made a nice little tent between the wall and the storyboards, and our friend crawled in there and went to sleep. He woke up to hear the voice in the room. It was Walt with some guests, and Walt was reading the storyboards to the guests, moving them away from the wall one after another as he went through the story. The poor man had to decide whether to try to crawl out from behind the boards and out of the room when Walt had his head turned, or stay put, stop breathing, and pray that Walt didn't move the last board. He stayed put. Walt didn't move the last board. Next up are a couple of stories from Marty Sklar. Marty would end his career at Disney by overseeing Imagineering and also by being named a Disney legend. But he came from modest beginnings. While a student at UCLA in the mid-1950s, he served as the editor for the college paper, the Daily Bruin. Based on just that experience, Walt hired him at the age of 21 to create a souvenir newspaper at Disneyland called the Disneyland News, which included stories about the park and its development, as well as short interviews with people who worked there. Sklar would later join other divisions within Walt Disney Productions. He would also write many of Walt's speeches and personal statements, as he had a good feel for Walt's sense of language and his vision. In the late 1960s, as these memories were being collected, he looked back over his career at Disney, which at that time was only a dozen years long, and he could see how Walt routinely looked at young employees and considered what roles they might eventually fill in his organization, and that is the central idea in his first memory this week. A comment on Walt in youth, although this is not really in the nature of an anecdote. Because the continuity of personnel at Walt Disney Productions is extraordinary in the entertainment industry, I think one point that is often overlooked is the ability Walt had to instill this same spirit in the youth of the company. I think you would be astounded to talk with some of the young guys, many in their mid-20s or late 20s now, at Mapo, and see the devotion, more than that, the feeling that Walt was kind of a kindred soul to them. These are young men in the mechanical end of the business, of course, and this attitude is partially explained by Walt's devotion to innovation in technical areas. But for these guys, to use Walt's own term, Walt kind of held out a weenie and said, "You're great this time, but maybe there's even a better way." What better incentive to produce at or above your capabilities than this attitude? I felt the same thing myself. One of the first things that brought me into close contact with Walt was in the production of a brochure about Liberty Street in the fall of 1956. That was an area then being considered for Disneyland and now for Florida. Early the next year, I did 2 more brochures, one about Edison Square, it later became the GE Carousel of Progress, and the first overall brochure about Disneyland, both published through WED in the spring of 1957. I was 23 years old at the time and didn't know a damn thing. But I guess Walt saw something he liked because he put me on the first concept for the Hall of Presidents show, and I wrote up the first concept on that in 1957. It was then turned over to Jim Algar to write the show itself. I bring this up because I was then in publicity and marketing at Disneyland and remained there. But about a year later, I was having coffee with Eddie Meck, Disneyland's publicity manager since the beginning, and Walt sat down with us. "What are you doing?" he asked me. I said working in publicity, the news and feature stories about the park and all the publications. And Walt said, in front of my immediate boss, "Hell, we've got to get you out of that. You can do other things more important." Well, another year or two went by, and I really didn't think anything about what Walt had said. But one day I received a call from Dick Irvine to come up to WED, that Walt wanted me to work with Ford and GE on developing show concepts for the World's Fair. The point I'm trying to make is that he kept all of this stuff somewhere in his mind, kept all his cast stacked in this amazing filing cabinet in his head, and when the right occasion arose, he would shuffle the cards and come up with people he had pegged as right for certain kinds of jobs. And it was always a great incentive for a young man like myself to know that Walt knew about you and what you could and could not do, and also that he was willing to put such faith in the young people like myself or the guys at Mapo who had such pressure and responsibility in terms of the World's Fair. I'll never forget going to dinner in Detroit with John Hench, Jack Sayers, and Vic Green of our company, and Mott Heath of Ford Marketing. He was our first contact on Ford's $20+ million show and pavilion at the New York World's Fair. During the course of the evening, Mott asked me how old I was, and when I said 26, he almost passed out. Here was his whole future at Ford, his life really partially wrapped up in what someone younger than his own son was helping to do. But it never troubled me because I figured Walt had put me there because he thought I could do a certain kind of job. And that was the kind of thing he saw on this particular project. In our next story, Marty Sklar, now as a writer working for WED, talks about the struggle he faced when helping Walt arrange and finalize corporate agreements for the New York World's Fair. Ultimately, Disney would design 4 elaborate attractions for the New York World's Fair: the Carousel of Progress, the Ford Magic Skyway, It's a Small World, and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. Each needed to have a corporate or government sponsor who would, with one exception, pay entirely for the development and creation of their attraction. Among the most difficult was General Electric. In the early 1960s, General Electric was emerging from a major price-fixing scandal where they had worked in collusion with other manufacturers of electrical industrial equipment that made things such as turbines, generators, and transformers. In secret, General Electric had met with other manufacturers of such equipment. This was a relatively small group because the equipment was specialized, and together they arranged all of their bids for large projects, including for government contracts. The group, which included General Electric, Westinghouse, and a few others, arranged their bids significantly above cost so that there was no one meaningfully low bid, and then together, one by one, they submitted them. In each case, there was just one bid slightly below the others, which became the winner. And General Electric and the other companies alternated which firm had the winning bid. In 1962, GE was convicted of price fixing. People in their company went to jail. And after that, the company hoped that a large pavilion at the 1964 World's Fair, including the Carousel of Progress, would help whitewash their corporate image. Here is Marty Sklar's memory of working with that company, particularly with one very difficult vice president at General Electric. World's Fair, I mentioned that we had a lot of trouble with one particular GE vice president. He was in charge of marketing, but his background was selling heavy equipment, and typically he had reached his level of incompetency, to use the Peter Principle analogy. Anyway, when Walt first presented the idea for the show he wanted to do for GE, this vice president reacted in the best possible way to get Walt riled up. Instead of saying something like, "Oh, well, that's not exactly what we had in mind," he made a frontal assault on the show, which is basically the same carousel show as now is playing under GE sponsorship in Disneyland. The storyline is the story of progress through electricity from the 1890s through today. The vice president's complaint was that GE didn't want to tie itself to the past. It was a progressive company. Isn't the word implicit in its slogan? And furthermore, the public isn't interested in nostalgia. At this point, Walt had it, and the atmosphere in the room became very tense, as Walt told the GE VP that he had a track record of making nostalgic things that the public loved. After the meeting, Walt was so incensed that, as I recall, and here Bill Cottrell could fill us in, Walt had the lawyers start looking into getting us out of this contract with GE for the World's Fair show. It so happened that a week or two later, Gerald Filippi, then president, now chairman of the board of GE, came out on vacation and visited both Disneyland and WED, and had lunch with Walt at the studio. During the course of the luncheon, Walt said, "Say, Mr. Filippi, I'm having trouble with one of your vice presidents." And that was the last upper echelon problem, other than monetary, we had with GE. The show went on to become the number 3 in attendance at the fair, and probably number 1 in popularity. It had less capacity than the General Motors Show or the Vatican Pavilion with its exhibition of Michelangelo's Pieta. In fact, at the beginning of the second year of the fair, GE showed its appreciation for Walt when the company's entire executive committee honored him at a dinner in their pavilion. Mrs. Disney, Bob, and Sharon Brown attended. They presented Walt with some kind of special gift. Mrs. Disney could tell you, or we could find out from GE. This is particularly interesting to me, because GE went into the fair to try to offset the price-fixing scandals of the early 1960s. And the result, according to a private survey they had made, was a dramatic increase in favorable attitudes towards the company, from 75% to 85% in the period 1961 to 1965, with even stronger recovery in the New York area, and a corresponding increase in major appliance sales. In GE's terms, that means millions of dollars. And the report said the increase in favorable attitudes was strongly linked to Walt Disney. It was factors such as these, General Electric told us, the popularity and quality of the Disney product plus the results it can generate, which led members of our executive office to approve the moving of major portions of Progress Land's show to Disneyland. And let me, for a moment, just jump back in here and finish Marty's story for him. By that he meant this was the reason that the Carousel of Progress eventually made its way from the GE pavilion called Progress Land out to Disneyland, and then later, ultimately, to the Magic Kingdom at Disney World. Next up are some stories about Walt growing older. The first story is by artist T.H. T.H. started at the studio in the 1930s, then left in the mid-1940s to become an art instructor and work some other jobs, but he returned again in the 1950s. T.H. during this period looked a little like Walt, with a soft chin, dark mustache, and some elasticity around the middle. This story almost surely takes place during that period when Walt's hair and his own mustache were starting to take on a little gray, and after T.H. was in an accident at home. Well, I had fallen off a horse at my farm and injured my hip bone. I was walking with a cane. I got rid of the cane, but I was still limping around. I was coming out of one of the writer's offices down here on the 3rd floor, and Walt was standing in the main hall with Jim Algar, one of his directors. I started to go along because I saw they were in conference, and I said, "Hi, Walt." He said, "Hi, T, how's the leg?" I said, "It's a lot better." With that, he walked over toward me, and he looked at me and said, "Feeling all right?" I said, "Yeah, why?" And he stared right at me, and he said, "Do you dye your mustache?" I said, "Yes, sir, every morning I put chicken shit on it." And he rolled down the hallway, saying, "Oh, you SOB," laughing and hysterical. Another story about Walt getting older comes from Disneyland publicist Joe Reddy. Reddy managed much of the public relations and publicity department at the park during Walt's lifetime. And before I read it, there are two names that I should point out. The first is Richard Schickel. This is the film critic for Time magazine in the mid-1960s, who would eventually write an unofficial and mostly unflattering biography on Walt called The Disney Version. Schickel was researching that project during the final years of Walt's life. The company didn't approve of Schickel's project nor give him access to executives and artists. To get around this, Schickel sometimes would attend Disney publicity functions, as he was the art critic for Time magazine, and while there he would ask questions both for an article for Time and also questions for what would become his biography on Walt. A biography that portrayed Walt as uniquely gifted but very controlling. That he's mentioned in this anecdote really confirms that this story takes place around 1966. Also, Joe Reddy mentions Tom Jones. This is not the actor or singer of the same name, but rather a member of the publicity department who worked alongside Joe Reddy. Here's the story. Did Walt know he was going to die? Very possibly. In the summer preceding his death, many newspaper people visited the studio and Disneyland. It was on one of these junkets that Richard Schickel gathered his background on the studio and interviewed Walt. One of these trips ended with a party at Disneyland in Walt's private apartment. It was a congenial group, and Walt enjoyed himself immensely. Afterwards, he walked Tom Jones and his wife Bee to Tom's car. Walt said, "Oh, I really enjoyed that. It was one of the nicest evenings I've spent." They agreed. One said, "Well, that was a good group. We'll have to arrange for more just like it." "No," Walt said, "there won't be any more." Bee said, "Sure there will." "No," Walt continued, "I'm 64 now, and I'm not getting any younger, you know." Bee said, "Oh, Walt, you've got lots of good years ahead of you. There'll be lots more wonderful parties." He smiled. "No, I won't live forever." There was a long silence. He concluded, Let's just say this was a wonderful evening and I won't forget it. And then, after this, on the typed piece of paper where Joe Reddy offered this anecdote, there is a handwritten note. I couldn't tell you whose handwriting it is, but the note says this. Roy described the beginning of the end. In our longest segment today, we again have Bob Jackson. And here we have what is the most complete personal account of Walt's press conference concerning his proposed Mineral King ski resort in the California Sierras. This was written by Bob Jackson a couple of years after the event itself, when the details were still fresh in Bob's mind. I should also point out that at the time he wrote this, Bob Jackson, along with everyone else at Disney, still believed the project would move forward to completion. So when Jackson talks about this dream materializing, it is with a sense of optimism, even though this project would later be canceled. So now, here is the best account of one of Walt's final public events, less than 3 months before his death. Location: Mineral King Valley, September 19, 1966. Walt Disney's last press conference. Background: on December 17, 1965, Walt Disney's plans for the development of year-round recreational facilities at Mineral King in California's High Sierra were chosen from 6 plans received by the U.S. Forest Service from private industry. Except for the 4 shows at the New York World's Fair, 1964 to 1965, Walt had limited his 3-dimensional world to Disneyland. Now, for the first time since the Magic Kingdom opened in July 1955, Walt was stepping outside its boundaries to develop a permanent 3D Disney project. This fact contributed significantly to the world's interest in Mineral King. Stipulated in the Forest Service agreement was the requirement for a new all-weather access road to Mineral King from the gateway community of Three Rivers, California. The Disney organization had sought assurance from the state of California that its highway division would plan, design, and construct such a road, a cooperative effort between business and government that would contribute materially to satisfying an urgent public need for more outdoor recreation areas. Governor Edmund G. Pat Brown and Walt Disney agreed to meet on the Mineral King site in the presence of news media representatives for the purpose of focusing public attention on Mineral King and its potentials, and to permit the governor to declare publicly his administration's support for the road, as well as to announce the availability of $3 million in federal funds to be used for road construction. High noon Monday, September 19, 1966, was set for the Walt Disney Governor Pat Brown press conference in Mineral King Valley, site of the proposed Disney development of facilities for year-round recreational uses. The valley is located approximately 55 miles east of Visalia in the southern sector of the High Sierras. Since I had been handling the public relations program for the Mineral King project since its development, July 1965, I was called on to coordinate arrangements for the press conference with representatives of the state. Newsmen from all sections of California announced plans to attend the gathering, made even more dramatic by the public confrontation of staunch Republican Walt Disney and Democrat Edmund Brown, within a few weeks of the election in which the governor would seek his 3rd term. His opponent, Ronald Reagan, longtime friend of Walt Disney's. Despite weather forecasts to the contrary, the day turned out to be unreasonably cold. By mid-morning, the usually purple-blue Mineral King sky and yellower than usual sun were obscured by heavy gray clouds boiling over the surrounding 12,000-foot peaks. The thermometer was having difficulty staying at the 20-degree mark as large, widely spaced drops of rain splattered intermittently. Members of the Walt Disney Party arrived by motorcade following a flight in the Disney plane from Burbank to Visalia Airport. Word was received meanwhile that the governor would arrive later than the appointed hour. We also learned that buses bearing the press from Tulare County airports were also running late because traveling the very poor, dangerous road from the town of Three Rivers to the valley would require more time than was originally estimated. And the temperature continued its stubborn refusal to vault the line at 20 degrees. Because of optimistic weather forecasts, most members of the party were attired in business suits, although some of the Mineral King Project veterans were prodded into wearing heavier clothing by teeth-chattering memories of chilling days in the Highlands. Walt had foresight enough to take along a heavy camping jacket and to wear woolen trousers. The press did arrive in time to record Walt's welcoming Governor Brown to Mineral King. At a makeshift conference table between two large trees in the heart of the valley, Walt and the governor, surrounded by staff personnel from Walt Disney Productions and the state of California, discussed the many needs for Mineral King. The governor then issued the statement that he would personally endorse the project and do whatever was necessary to see that it reached fruition, including the guarantees that the state would build the access road. Governor Brown concluded by announcing that $3 million in federal funds would be available to assist with road construction. Walt expressed thanks on his own behalf and for his company. Reporters then asked several questions, mostly about specific plans for the facilities, construction timing, and the expected economic impact the project would have on Tulare County. At the time of this press conference, measurable opposition to the development had, as yet, not materialized. Later, within a matter of 2 months, the muscular arm of arch conservation and preservation groups would be raised in an effort to halt the project. Therefore, no press questions dealt with opposition to the plans. By mid-September, it was known within and outside the organization that Walt would enter the hospital in November for a checkup and for therapeutic measures. It was no surprise then that Walt's appearance drew comment of concern from 2 members of the press, both of whom mentioned to me that he did not look well. I attributed his fatigue and pallor to the high altitude and cold. Following the official press conference, Walt excused himself and went into the store, a combination cafe and general store operated by Mr. and Mrs. Bill de Carteret, longtime residents of Mineral King. Walt was warming himself in front of a wood-burning stove when I entered to tell him that members of the press required his return outside. They wanted photos with Governor Brown taken against the scenic beauty of Mineral King's southern area. Walt's complexion was ashen, and this is the first time that I became truly worried about his well-being. A fleeting thought that he was perhaps ill was erased quickly by my previous explanation to the 2 reporters. In a very quiet manner, Walt asked me to delay the photos for a few minutes until I catch my breath and can rest a bit. He had been alone until I entered, but we were soon joined by other members of the assemblage. I returned to the press group to assist with photo setups. Walt came out a few minutes later and posed with Governor Brown. The entire group ate boxed lunches embellished by hot baked beans and plenty of coffee, which helped only temporarily neutralize the cold. At shortly after 2 p.m., Governor Brown left by helicopter while Walt and the Disney party departed in the motorcade. And so, after nearly a half century of meeting news media representatives in press conferences and becoming a perennial favorite with newsmen because of his honesty, wit, and descriptive powers, Walt Disney's last official press conference came to a close, fittingly on the site where another unique Disney dream would materialize. Submitted by Robert Jackson. I should add as a postscript to this that Walt would go into the hospital, that Walt would have cancer removed from one of his lungs, and that within 3 months of this press conference, he would die. Our last story today is from Disney artist Bruce Bushman, who in the 1950s was one of Walt's early designers for Disneyland and considered the father of Fantasyland. But here, about 13 or maybe 14 years after Disneyland opened, he comments on how, even after Walt's passing, he, like many of those who were close to Walt, at times sensed that something like the spirit of Walt or the idea of Walt was still near him. Or maybe put it like this, simply the memories of Walt were so strong that for some of the people who worked with him, that the idea of Walt's presence stayed with them long after his death. In this story, Bushman discusses the time after he left the employ of Walt Disney Productions that he was working in Florida with a producer named Ivan Tors. In the mid to late 1960s, Tors had set up a small studio in North Miami focused on creating shows that featured people alongside exotic animals. His production company had a number of big hits on TV, including Flipper, which included a trained dolphin, Gentle Ben, which included a large brown bear, and Sea Hunt, which regularly included sharks, eels, and manta rays. To capitalize on Florida tourism and also the coming Disney park, Ivan Tors wanted to develop a theme park called Torsland, which would be focused on animals and TV production. For this project, he hired Bruce Bushman, who for a time lived outside Miami during those same years that Roy and the Disney organization were starting to develop Walt Disney World just outside of Orlando. During a period of perhaps a week or two, in which Tors had his offices redecorated, including the one that Bushman used, Bushman was tasked with visiting various animal attractions across Florida, both to gather ideas for Torsland and to find ways to make Torsland distinct from other animal parks presently in the state, such as Gatorland. While moving through the state, Bushman thought he'd look at the Disney property, then little more than a swamp, a set of lakes, and piles of dirt that were then being moved around. But perhaps if he went over there, he might see some of his old friends. He decided to go over unannounced. Torsland ultimately would never be built, but at the time, Bruce Bushman, of course, didn't know this. He was simply moving through the state doing research. Here's how Bushman recounts the afternoon that he tried to drive onto Disney property to see the land that Disney was developing as he drove over dirt and gravel roads, trying to find some center of development. Well, as I reached the boundary line, the heavens opened up and rain came down in torrents. I slowed for 4 or 5 miles per hour and couldn't see past the windshield. I stopped thinking the cloudburst would be over soon, but it wasn't. It kept up. Knowing that I couldn't sit in my car all day, I turned around and drove back up the road. When I came to the edge of the Disney property, the rain let up. I figured that Walt, sitting up there, just didn't want me to see his new property, and that was his way of telling me. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Also, we're about a month out from the new book being released, Making Mary Poppins, which comes out November 11th from Norton. I will have some events in November and December. Hopefully some of you can join me there. But right now, the book is available as a hardback, as a Kindle edition, and as an Audible book over on Amazon. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.